I began to talk and I shared my testimony with you. And that day after we had shared and you kind of inspired me. You encouraged me to write, and your testimony needs to be heard. And although I had been sharing it in conferences and places like that, I will never forget, we were at the Wailing Wall the next day, and I wrote on the paper, "Lord, I'm ready to be creative for your glory again." And when I backed away from that wall, the lyrics to the song "Take Him to the Place" began flooding my soul. And for the next couple hours, I walked around in Israel with my phone just, typing out the lyrics. And
yeah, we were the bus captains, so we were supposed to be in the front, and here's Amanda in the back, typing away,
Yeah, and he was like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm writing a song." And he remembers the first time that I began to sing him what the Lord had given. He began to weep because we lived it.
Absolutely.
We lived this testimony. I lived it a lot longer, but he lived a portion of it too. It comes from a place of pain and yet a place of victory. I was sexually abused beginning at the age of 5 and carried on until I was about 9 from different men in my life. And the one thing that was the common thread was you can't ever tell. So the enemy had placed a gag order on my life. I carried that into my teenage years, covered up with shame and defeat. I felt dirty. I felt like it was my fault, that I had done something wrong. Had I been different? And not only that, if the Lord loved me and he is all-seeing and all-knowing, then where was he? And that was a question that I carried. I was raised in church. One of my abusers in particular went to church with me. So I must be different. The Lord must not care about me like he cares about everybody else. So I hid this dark, deep pain, didn't tell anybody. And so when I met him, we were 19 years old. We were babies. The enemy taunted me and tormented me and said, "He will never love you if he truly knows what happened to you, where you have been, what you have done, and therefore you can't tell him." So the gag order continued on into my marriage, and after about 2 years of marriage, and he can go back now and go, I can see where there were questions and where, he couldn't put all the pieces together. Traveling around with the Crab family, the enemy would say, "Look at you traveling around in ministry. You see everybody else get their victories and their breakthroughs, but you will never have it because you can't come clean. You can't tell. Your husband doesn't even know who you are, but you can't tell him." It was a constant war in my soul. And in August of 2003, we were in Central City, Kentucky. The Crab family was sound checking. The bus was backed up behind the stage, and it's an outside concert that about 3,000 people come in attendance every year. And the music was so loud, and I knew that I was the only person on the bus that day. And I screamed out to God with everything that I had. And I said, "God, if you don't do something in my life, I'm going to leave him." Because I would rather walk away and not feel the pain of rejection, because I already had so much bitterness and hurt and anger and frustration that I didn't want to add rejection on top of that, because he couldn't love me. I already had that in my mind from the seeds of the enemy. He couldn't love me. So I screamed and said, "God, if you don't do something, I'm out." And the awesome thing about God is that when you get to a place of true desperation in him, he will do supernatural things. And that day he sent a lady. I walked off the bus, walked about 50 feet to the product table, was going to do my job. And this little lady came up and she said, "I need to speak with you."
Rana Sipes.
Rana. And I said, "Okay." I didn't know her. She didn't know me. And when I said, "Okay," she said, "No, we need to go privately and have a conversation." And I said, "Okay." So I followed her about a block back behind a nursing home in Central City, Kentucky, and we sat on an embankment. And she began to tell me everything about my life that I had never spoken to another human being. God sent an agent of hope to my rescue. That place of desperation, that bitterness of soul that I was crying out, and He sent someone to meet me there. And I laid in her lap and I wept for over 2 hours, and she just stroked my hair for the first time. I didn't have to say a word. I didn't have to confess anything. God knew it all. And that was His way of saying, I've been there the whole time. I watched your hurt. I watched the pain. I watched your fear. And now my glory is going to be seen through it. And she said, now that you have emptied yourself of all of that junk, I'm going to pray that God fills every crack and every crevice. And boy, our life at that point forever was changed. The power of God consumed me in a way that I never knew possible. And the minute He saw me, He said, what has happened to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
This boldness of just prayer and seeking the Lord. And I spent literally 6 months in a prayer closet. Anytime I would fear Him, wanting to leave or someone finding out, I would go and I would lay in my prayer closet. And after about 6 months, I told Him everything. There was a healing that came, and I shared everything with Him. And God has been faithful every step of the way.
It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you.
Are you hurting? Are you hanging on to shame and guilt? Take Jesus to that place and let Him restore your broken heart so that you can share your unshakable faith with others and give Him glory. This is today's life. I'll see you next week.
What an awesome testimony. I mean, it just makes you just cry when you hear about the brokenness and all that she experienced. And yet she saw God take her to the place, and He was always there in the midst of her brokenness. That brokenness was so terrible for her, but there was redemption.
Yeah, I was trying to, just for a second, try to put myself in her shoes at 5 years old to 9 years old. I have an 8-year-old son. I cannot imagine a child being forced to walk through something like that. But God is so faithful. He just will come in and consume and wash over you, and He cares about our deepest issues that even nobody else knows about.
That's right. And I just thought that abuse is like a slave. You become a slave to that abuse because your whole life is curtailed by that deception, by that brokenness. And to become out of a slave or out of slavery, you have to have a bondage breaker.
Right.
That has to be a force of bondage breaker in your life.
Right.
And that's only Jesus. That is only Jesus.
What happened in her case, which I believe is how Lord many times works, is she called it an agent of hope.
Yeah.
So here comes a person anointed by the Holy Spirit, walking in the gifts of the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
Right.
who intersects her life
Right.
and brings her out, and then prophetically proclaims over her all these things that has happened. She didn't say it to this lady. The lady knew it from a word of knowledge, or word of knowledge is what it would have been. And God supernaturally brought her into that place of healing that He had already prepared for her.
That's right.
That's what I think. It just wasn't a coping mechanism.
No.
It wasn't just talk it through and it all work out all the details and it'll all feel better
Just
in the end.
counsel and you'll be okay.
Which is all good. Nothing wrong with any of that. That's okay. But in this case, and I think in many cases that we don't allow to happen because of whatever reason, we don't open ourselves up to the supernatural around us, or we don't obey God. What if that woman would not obey God and not went with that message to her? Then we don't know what the end of the story would have been. But she did say yes to the Spirit, and then she went to her, took her out, and they went and sat and talked. Yeah,
Right.
see how God did that? That's
That's
just
the
so cool.
vulnerability of that hope agent, you know,
Yeah.
because she didn't know how Amanda was going to receive that, you know, but in that experience, Amanda received help, but also healing.
There are
There's
people
a
car-
distinction.
There are people today that are carrying those secrets in their lives, you know, those secrets that
Yeah.
they don't want to hold anymore. What do you say to them?
Wow, I am at a loss for words. My heart is heavy for the secrets that you're carrying, but you know those secrets aren't meant to be carried any longer. And when you cry out to Christ in desperation, He is able to take those secrets away from you. There's help for you, but more importantly, not only is there help, but there's healing, isn't there, Amy?
Oh, a deep healing that only the hand of God and the breath of God can heal. I was thinking while they were talking about the story of Joseph. I mean, he was betrayed, lied about, thrown in prison, sold. He had a lot of issues really going on in his heart. And then he ends up saying at the end of Genesis, what you meant for bad, God actually meant for good, and it was for the saving of many lives. So I think how God can take our bitterness and the bitter things in life, and He can turn them around by His miraculous hand and somehow shift it to where it becomes a sweetness, to where you actually can help others. It's amazing, isn't it?
Oh, it is amazing. It sure is. And you know, this story is on Today's Life. It is Today's Life. It airs tonight at 10:30, and then again on Saturday at 3:30 as well.
Well, if you're in a place and you know